Hello, Internet! It is time for another Wednesday serial. This week I'm only talking about the one book, and it is The Suspect You'd Expect It to Be. Boom! But, if by popular demand you want to talk to me about the rest of the books I picked up this week, which was a mighty stack, I could be persuaded to do so. But my heart right now really only focuses on this book and a bit of my history with this character. So I'm going to really delve in. This is going to be a completely self-indulgent video. So, everybody loves that, right? So I think if you're interested in Spider-Man, this book is definitely worth picking up. I think this is a fun moment for the character. I think there's a lot going on and a lot showing that things are going to be a lot of fun moving forward. Overall, I've been a fairly big proponent of Dan Slott's Spider-Man, but I kind of want to build up to that and then talk about why this issue, I believe, shows that we're really back on track for part of what makes Spider-Man fun and, more importantly, relevant. So as a wee lad growing up a young Wednesday's serial, nurturing his base of knowledge, I read a good chunk of Spider-Man with whatever else I read. I mean, when I really started comics, I read Spider-Man, X-Men, and Ninja Turtles, and nothing else. I've obviously diversified since then, but my heart still rests there with X-Men off and on, because X-Men comes in seasons. But Spider-Man always really engaged me, and engaged me the way that I think most comic fans are engaged by Batman. And I'm more on this other side, and there's a lot of reasons why I feel that works for me better, but that's not really important. What I do find, though, is that I understand a lot of the base, but I was never a huge fan of where a lot of people draw a lot of their love for Spider-Man, which was from the really early Stan Lee days. Don't get me wrong, the Ditko art has a lot of amazing stuff to it, but when you start understanding the writing process and stuff, you start realizing that, yeah, Steve Ditko really did make Spider-Man what it was, and Stan Lee kind of just filled in the blanks. And so I'm not so big on a lot of that, and I certainly didn't find out about the Marvel process and stuff until much later, as in, within the last couple of years. But that stuff never really resonated with me, and a huge part of that is because it was decades before I was born that stuff really resonated with. And Spider-Man, more than most superheroes, I'd even say, is really informed by the times and reinvents itself every generation or so to kind of be relevant. And whether or not that's to be hip or not, well, sometimes it is, and sometimes it's actually because the story needs to take place in something that matters for the time, because otherwise Spider-Man doesn't quite work. So there is definitely some Spider-Man lore. I mean, there's, the Gwen Stacy thing, the Captain Stacy thing before that. There's, Kraven's Last Hunt, Soul of the Hunter, if you want to go a little further. There's tons of great classic, kind of mythos-building Spider-Man stories that in some ways are fairly timeless, but there's other parts that are almost more key to Spider-Man that really inform it. The SNL issues, the way that right before Gwen's death, that Harry was dealing with drugs, that is a landmark pop culture moment. That's not just a comic moment, and that was really rooted in the times, the way things were going on. There's also and then the idea of the flying without the code, that is really rooted comics history. And I mean, you go forward and you see Spider-Man not just being, a photographer, but publishing a magazine and branching out back when, Time and People were a lot more relevant to the American culture. And then you see different characters in the Spider-Man universe kind of breaking away from the paper and creating Frontline, and it's this kind of newspaper but more bloggy, responsive thing. And then you see Spider-Girl spinning off of that and being basically existing in a Twitterverse sort of thing, and Spider-Man not being a photographer but then being a scientist, and to be relevant he's doing all this crazy gadgetry stuff, because if you're relatively smart, why aren't you part of some crazy startup? Because that's more of the culture that we're in, and if Spider-Man's not in that culture in that moment, he's not some billionaire. He's not some... I mean, Peter Parker is not some larger-than-life character trying to learn something about humanity or really honestly trying hard to find crime. Trouble finds him, and he makes the best of it, and that's what Spider-Man's almost there for, and Spider-Man's part of that life, but not all of it, so you need to have that balance of the humanity and then the problems that come with that, and the people's hero who does the best and more or less tries to fix it. And that's where a lot of the rotating and different sidecasts from the different eras and the different creators come from, highlighting different problems. I mean, there was a time when Peter Parker had a deaf little girl neighbor, and that was something that they focused on in a lot of those issues. There's always some socially relevant aspect to the character in its highest seasons, and when Spider-Man doesn't have that element, Spider-Man flounders as a character because what draws people to it isn't there. Or at least that's my opinion. So, beyond all the pre-stuff, when I really started collecting comics monthly, the first comic I picked up monthly and stayed with pretty long without a break was The Amazing Spider-Man. When I did it, it was Straczynski. Straczynski was kind of my first creator-focused Spider-Man understanding. And it's probably one of the most atypical eras of Spider-Man. Putting him as a teacher, playing more with mystical elements and the idea of spirituality bumping up against science and all that, and playing with all these ideas made Spider-Man a different kind of character and different kind of animal. And for where I was in my life and for the character was at that point, a lot of stuff really resonated with me well, a lot better than if I was to read it now. But I still pick out a few of the stories from that time and say those are some of the greatest Spider-Man stories ever told. Some of it's amazing, and it didn't hurt that the art at the time was just phenomenal, and a lot of it I still don't think has really been matched as far as your general Spider-Man comic. And then Civil War happened, and then the bombshell for Spider-Man hit. One More Day really set the character back in a lot of ways, and it was kind of crazy because, I mean, you had regular books coming out and all these different titles, and suddenly across the different titles, the issues crawled out, and it just led to one of this incredibly disappointing moments. You've all heard about that, and if you haven't, just look it up the internet for a while. That was a big, big deal. And then as soon as we got past the painful part that because Marvel set up something terrible with Peter taking off his mask, and of course they had to come back from that, and they were going to, even though real-life newspapers were reporting on the fact that Peter was out and how it was this whole different thing, comic fans knew it was just going to cycle over. And when they did, it was written terribly. But once we got on the flip side of it, it got better. It took me some months to bother to check it out because I'd sworn off Spider-Man because it just was so heinous. But it got better. So who is the spin doctor that pushed it all around? It was when we started off with what I call kind of the TV series chunk of Spider-Man when it was coming out 3 times a month. They ditched all the general books and just said amazing 3 times a month. And occasionally they had a Spider-Man miniseries or like a Spider-Man Unlimited. And of course, the Ultimate Universe was going on, but that's separate. You just had these 3 amazing books a month. Well, they're generally pretty good anyways. But who led that off was Dan Slott. And with this whole crazy idea of what if some just general crook stole one of Spider-Man's web shooters. And yes, he had the web shooters back. And that was kind of a big deal because of the movies. Not a big deal, but I hate the fact that the movie seeped in and changed the comics just cause. And so, yeah, there was that, and then we had some Joe Kelly stories, some Mark Waid stories, and there was just all these great stories. But Dan Slott did lead it off, and then there was this whole deal culminating after making a big deal about Spider-Man's going to be new and different, dealing with some new villains, Mr. Negative, Speedball, and nothing really ever became of her, and a couple others. There's this big deal about, we're bringing back the Rogues Gallery of Spider-Man. So they had the Gauntlet, which was this whole big conceit to have. A lot of them are really cool stories, bringing back old Spider-Man villains and kind of amping them up to make them kind of not the jokes that some of them had become, because some Spider-Man villains just became jokes. This was to get over that. But ultimately it was to bring Kraven back to life, and to my knowledge, not really much has been done with Kraven since then, which is hilarious because at this point that was years ago. And so they brought Kraven back for who knows. But then Dan Slott took over Spider-Man and completely changed the status quo, started doing all kinds of fun things. Spider-Man's working at a tech startup, which makes so much sense because it's a way to make him more relevant. But a lot of the old Bugle characters started finding their own little nooks. I mean, you had some play with Frontline. Jonah becomes the mayor, and a lot of that cast gets dragged with him. And then you have like these new women in Peter's life, and it's really fun, and it makes Spider-Man's New York become a lot more alive, and it starts feeling more like Batman's Gotham. There's just this vibrant city going around, and yeah, some of it's rooted in reality, but some of it's rooted with all this cool stuff going on, and it feels like Spider-Man's part of it, and these stories deal with that, and that was a good way to really root Spider-Man and give these books kind of their own place, while Spider-Man's off with 3 or 5 teams that he was with at the time. It was just kind of ridiculous. And then just all this crazy stuff happens, and you can really see how Dan Slott's really doing a lot for the character and doing stuff that just bringing on another writer wouldn't do, because who else was going to come up with like Spider Island, which turns out was just a delay tactic because he wanted to do Superior earlier, but Marvel said not yet, and then finally, boom, Superior did happen. Which in so many ways feels like a basically 2-year brand new day. Something happened, the initial build-up was an okay story, and then we reach this final point and none of it's worth it, and it feels bad, and it's the smart character. But the minute we flip around, we're getting more of what makes Spider-Man cool again. So I don't want to argue here the relative merits of the Superior Spider-Man, because I still feel like, whereas there's some cool stuff in there, for as long as it was, you'd really hope so. The ending, whereas it was really, really nice to finally get Peter back and have the fun and the energy and some of the relevance of Spider-Man come back, the ending of that, unless they play it up somewhere later, it just is flat. It's a bad ending. No question. But it was also different than Brand New Day in the fact that it was a bad ending, but the bad part of it was over like that. It's like a few pages, and then boom, we have Peter back, and then there's all this other stuff, whatever. So nowhere near as painful as far as being a Spider-Man fan reading it. And now we get this. Now, this issue isn't grand. It isn't great. This is not the best Spider-Man thing you could be picking up for $6. Although, yeah. And you get Inhuman #1 in the I didn't even bother reading it. But what you do get is something that is very definitively Peter Parker. You get the White Rabbit, which is always fun. And you get a lot of the city back. You get Peter Parker dealing with life back. You get the weird romance stuff back. You're suddenly dealing with Electro at a bar and kind of like this underworld side that you don't see in a lot of books because they're not trying to build, kind of this landscape and a build-up of Electro. You get something with Black Cat that I was really wondering how it was going to play out of Superior, and that's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out, and might make the Black Cat much more of a villain, but more of an interesting character than the way she's been languished around for years. You get Spider-Man 2099, which, for those people, there's that. You get kind of a sense of the Scarlet Spider and kind of this other facet that had been spun out, and yes, so you get kind of a Spider-Man character in the New Warriors, and that's a great way for Marvel to have their cake and eat it too, and that's great. And, oh man, and then you get a play into what's one of the weirder parts coming out of all this, and that's the point ones and whatever that's going to be retelling Spider-Man's origin as if it was done a lot more currently. And that's one of the ballsiest and maybe dumbest moves, is this comic opens with 13 years ago Spider-Man was bit. 13 years ago? I mean, 2001? Really? Like, it, that's ballsy, because it kind of goes against the rubber band theory of time that we have with these continuity comics. But also it plays on this idea that the spider didn't instantly die, but it bit someone else. And that will be interesting to see. But you also have this kid who uploads the Amazing Fantasy 15 stuff to YouTube for all the public showing stuff, and has this fan of Spider-Man, wants to be like him. Like, it's this whole, like, different idea of the mythos, and certainly this has been done with Batman's mythos, where people just play with it so many times and it builds up and it's too much, and that defeats the point of a good, simple story. But it's kind of interesting to see this play. It's been done before to a much larger extent with Chapter 1 years ago, and changed all these little things about the origins of the Spider-Man mythos, and then none of them are even remembered today. I have a feeling that's ultimately what's going to happen with this, but I hope they're able to play it like this is a modern telling, and just do it to try to make Spider-Man more relevant. What's kind of iffy about that is you're going back to the origin, where some of the things Spider-Man does and says and how he acts makes sense for the time, doesn't make so much sense now, and that's part of what's good about just pushing forward. That's also what's interesting about this. It's pushing forward, whereas Superior was caught up in all of its bullshit, this is just saying, whatever, there's going to be some fallout from that. But then we're moving on to all these stories. We're dealing with Electro, we're dealing with Black Cat, and we're going to see what's going to happen. There's all the city, and there's all this drama around it. And that's what Spider-Man's supposed to be, a really awesome soap drama. And it's supposed to be fun, It's supposed to be heart-wrenching and heartwarming. It's supposed to run the gambit, and it's not supposed to be just mired with Doc Ock's blah and just seeing dumb decisions. It's supposed to be good decisions, not always greatly executed. It's Spider-Man. It's supposed to be fun. The downside of all this is that it is Dan Slott again. Dan Slott's been through, depending on how you look at it, like 3 to 4 seasons of Spider-Man now. His run is becoming Claremontian in its scope. It is a staggering achievement on one hand. On the other hand, whereas I don't think other writers would have done some stuff that Dan Slott's done with the character, and admittedly it helps that he's had so much time to a point. At the same point, coming back now, this is doing some different stuff, but more closer to the status quo. And he's had so much time with the character that I can't help but think bringing in some different talent would really help right now. It would really help to stand out, maybe let some of the smaller points slide right now, because this book kind of needs to get back on track fast. And as much as I like the Turning the New Corner, this was Amazing Spider-Man #1. If you didn't know what was going on coming into this book, you're lost. And that is not what this is about. They do a lot to try to cue you in, but it's all, again, all the small stuff that if a new writer was coming on and we were willing to forget that, it would work better. But it's not. So whereas I'm excited, and as a fan I'm really grateful, I still think, whereas this is so much better than where we were a month ago, there was kind of a misstep, and I would have much rather seen Superior go on for a few more months, finish properly, have a good ending, and then come here with, yeah, some of the baggage of the body swap and all that, but do it in a way that we're not letting people be lost because they're picking up from here because you're pointing them to pick up here. And if it takes you a few issues to get into the swing of it, that's the thing. Spider-Man, like I said, is a soap opera. You kind of have to dive in somewhere and absorb it, because there's very few starting points with this character, and he's one of the two just characters that if you're in this world, you have to appreciate on some level. So, I don't know. I'd really love to hear what you guys are thinking about Spider-Man, not just this issue, but where you feel the character is at in the now, excluding any bullshit about the movie, because I don't care about that movie. I care about the comics and where the character's at right now, and I really feel like this is a moment for Spider-Man to come back swinging.